Hey guys, Buildzoid from Actually Hardcore Overclocking here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the features of the X299 Dark motherboard. So let's get right into it, starting with the memory slot layout. So this board is, as you can clearly see, only equipped with 4 DIMM slots for your RAM. And the reason why this is actually a really cool feature for at least extreme overclockers and just competitive overclockers in general, you can be competitive on water cooling as well. The reason why this is a cool feature is that with the reduced number of memory slots, the memory traces are shorter because the slots are physically closer to the CPU socket. They're also better laid out because there's not as many traces necessary to, there's not as many traces that need to be routed for the 2 memory slots instead of 4. And the other thing is that a lot of the actual traces between 2 memory slots on the same memory channel are actually shared.
Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake and the View 71 enclosure. The View 71 is a full tower case that's capable of fitting 3 video cards in most configurations. It's also one of the better cooling cases in our recent case testing bench lineup. The View 71 has hinged tempered glass doors on either side that make it easy to open and show off. And it comes with at least one rain fan, though you can get the RGB version if you prefer. Learn more at the link in the description below.
This unoccupied memory slot actually introduces a lot of signal integrity issues for the memory slot that is occupied, and it actually negatively impacts your memory overclocking performance. So thanks to the fact that EVGA has this, 1 memory slot per memory channel layout, which is the same thing as what you would find on other top-of-the-line extreme overclocking targeted boards like the ASRock OC Formula, as well as the Asus Rampage 6 Apex. This board is capable of doing things like this right here. And what is this? Well, this is a screenshot that I took of memory of basically a Geekbench run that I did, and mostly what the focus was just memory tuning. I didn't really hammer the CPU that much, even though 4.86 gigahertz on the 14-core CPU is it's pretty significant. The CPU was peaking at about 500 watts. No, not 500 watts. 550 watts actual CPU power, CPU heat output. Thermals weren't great, but this was just basically a quick benchmark run. And the board handled it just fine, but more importantly for me, the board does 1966 megahertz. So this is DDR4. That frequency right there translates to DDR4 3933. And look at those timings. That's CL12, 11, 11, 26, 240. So basically these are memory settings that you would expect from like, the Rampage 6 Apex or the OC Formula, which actually the OC Formula doesn't clock, for me at least, as high as the Dark does. So EVGA has done a really, really good job with this board. That memory layout absolutely works. There are very, very few motherboards out there that can do this on X299. There are very few motherboards on Z270 and Z370 that can do these kinds of settings. So it is really impressive that, EVGA has pulled this off, and this is in quad channel. So the memory layout that EVGA is using is definitely working. Now, here's a screenshot of a similar scenario, except this one is from Lumi, who is the #1 overclocker in Finland, and he got his RAM all the way to DDR4 4120 at basically the same memory timing. So he's still running that 12, 11, 11, 28. Well, I was running 26, but for TRAS, but he's still doing, 4120 megaticks per second at 12, 11, 11, 28 memory timings, which is like that. This is up there. there's a very short list of motherboards out like on the market that can do these kinds of settings, regardless of what platform you're looking at. So, yeah, EVGA's decision to go with the low memory slot count that we have here definitely paid off. This board is seriously impressive when it comes to memory overclocking, thanks to the memory slot layout that it comes with. Now then, let's move on to some of the more like features you can actually sort of feel and see, not just not ones that affect your overclocking kind of in the background. So you have a power button, you have a reset button, and you have a 4-digit postcode. And the reason for this is this postcode reads when you're done with the post process, this postcode will actually display CPU temperatures, and it reads, it reads just fine for positive temperatures. If you go over 99 degrees, then it'll just go from like 99 to A0, because that there is a 10. So basically that's 10 and a 0. And if this was a, say, 3, then, you'd have 103 degrees centigrade. So it reads CPU temperatures that way, but the reason why it actually has that second part of the digits is this actually does negative temperatures as well, and it goes accurate all the way down to minus 64 degrees centigrade. This is extremely handy for extreme overclockers because it allows you to check the condition of your thermal paste without worrying about stuffing a thermal probe behind the CPU, which the Dark does support. There is a hole in the middle of the CPU socket for putting a thermal probe through, but that's just way less convenient than, just using the postcode to read the temperature directly from the die. So very, very handy feature right there. Under that, you find a clear Cmos button and a whole bunch of LEDs for troubleshooting. These do things like indicate critical CPU errors, as well as the presence of your various voltages, like 12 volts, 5 volts, 5 volts standby, 3.3 volts, and any other voltages that the motherboard needs to operate that it gets from external sources. So that simplifies the troubleshooting process. You have similar LEDs actually scattered around the motherboard elsewhere, for example, above the memory slots, which you can't see, but they're there. Behind each memory slot, you have 2 LEDs. There's a white one and there's a red one. And these are actually super handy, in my opinion, because basically these LEDs indicate how many functioning memory slots you have. If they're all white, all your memory slots are working. I'm not sure if some of these LEDs turn off if you use a Kaby Lake X CPU. Like the white LED might not light up. If you're on a Kaby Lake X CPU, I do believe you'll only have the Kaby Lake X memory slots lighting up. All the other 2 memory slots will be blacked out. But so that's nice. You get a visual indicator of the LEDs. With like which memory slots are working. But the other thing is, when you train, that red LED indicates if your memory channel failed. So when you go through the post process, you're going to go through the postcodes B6 to B0 to B7. But really on the postcode, all you're really going to see is the B6 and B7 postcode flickering back and forth. And after that, if any of your memory channels has a red LED on it, you will know that that memory channel failed to train. And this is super handy because you can skip the entire process of going to the BIOS to fix your, like going to the BIOS or Windows to check if your memory failed. You will know immediately after startup if your memory is all working, which for normal users, this is not really a big deal. Memory training misses aren't that common until you start pushing the memory settings that I showed you earlier, like 3933 or 4120 at CL12, where actually getting the memory to train properly is often a matter of multiple reboots and like really fine-tuning some of the settings. So this gets very, very handy because it helps you troubleshoot any kind of memory boot issues before you get all the way into Windows and check that, oh yeah, we're not running quad channel, we're running triple channel. So that's a really, really nice feature to have right there, along with all of those LEDs. Now, the one thing that I think this board is missing, well, 2 things this board is missing, is there's no safe boot button. So that you're basically stuck clearing the BIOS every time you have any, like if you have a full memory training failure where all 4 of your memory slots for Skylake X turn red, or both of your memory slots for Kaby Lake X turn red, you're going to be hitting clear Cmos, because this motherboard is not particularly good at retraining, and there isn't really a retrain button. Like there's not a retry button either for attempting multiple train attempts quickly. But in my experience, it wouldn't really help you because I've tried retraining the board on the same settings multiple times, and it doesn't really get anywhere. Once all of your memory channels are failed, it's basically clear Cmos as the only way to get into the BIOS. The board compensates for the fact that you're going to be trashing your memory, like your BIOS settings, often by giving you a million profiles. Like, it can store by far the most profiles I've seen on any motherboard. But I'd really prefer if there was a safe boot button, which you just press and it gets you into the BIOS on safe settings without wiping the entire BIOS. A retry button to skip the entire, like, if you want to retrain a motherboard without a retry button, you need to cut PSU power to the motherboard and then, like, redo the entire, and then start it, then, you know, power it back up and see if it retrains. So that's, again, just a quality of life feature that's kind of missing. And then finally, the board lacks a slow mode switch, which I find very, like, for liquid nitrogen overclocking on X299, I find that rather concerning because even at just 4.9 gigahertz, the 14 core that I have idles on about 10 amp, on like 12 amps down the 12 volt connectors, which translates to about 140 watts idle if you turn off all your power savings, which you should do for extreme overclocking, which that 140 watts idle on liquid nitrogen translates into a lot of wasted liquid nitrogen, just keeping the system running at, well, idle. So I'd really appreciate if the board had a slow mode, because slow mode is on a lot of extreme overclocking motherboards, and the reason why it's there is it enables you to immediately drop the CPU from, you know, full speed to the lowest possible CPU ratio. So on X299, you could go, like, let's say you're doing LN2 overclocking and you're at 55x100. After slow mode, your 55x would go to 12x, and you'd be at 1.2 gigahertz. And this actually significantly reduces power consumption because you've just got like a more than 4 times decrease in core clock, which will actually cut your power consumption very significantly. So that would be really handy for, you know, like the time, like you boot up and when you're configuring your OS and opening benchmarks and making sure everything is just right. Slow mode would be extremely handy to have on this motherboard for LN2 overclocking, because X299 is really, really hot. And already on X99, slow mode was a feature I used a lot with the motherboards that had it, because it just saves you a lot of, it saves you liquid nitrogen. But yeah, this board doesn't have a slow mode, which is kind of unfortunate. It's not like a disaster because there's a lot of boards with no slow mode, but it is a nice quality of life feature, especially for a platform as power hungry as X299. Now, moving along, what it does give you as switch-wise is a BIOS switch. It's triple BIOS, which is kind of insane. Like, I don't know why you need triple BIOS, but it doesn't hurt, that's for sure. And, you know, 2 BIOS, I think, is the minimum BIOS count requirement for, like, a overclocking board. This has 3, so nothing to complain about here. Under that, you actually find the Socketable BIOS chips. So you can actually, like, if you manage to somehow brick all 3 of your BIOSes, you can actually ask for a replacement chip from EVGA, and it's not going to be a massive pain to do the swap, because a lot of other motherboards have the BIOS chips soldered into them. And if you brick all of your BIOS chips, there's, like, you're either going to have to get an external flashing device, or you're going to have to desolder the bricked BIOS chips and replace one of them with a good one to recover from. So yeah, the socketed BIOS chip is that's a nice feature. Under that, you find this connector right here, which is the Probit connector. Now, this is EVGA's implementation of voltage read points. It's a really clean implementation. It's unfortunately not a very useful one. And the reason for this is this doesn't, like, you can monitor VCC in, you can monitor VCore, VDIMM, and the problem with this is VCC PLL, which is a Kaby Lake X exclusive voltage, and VCCSA. And the problem with this is that on, say, Skylake X, for example, you also have VMesh, which I would like to be able to monitor, VCCIO, which I would like to be able to monitor, and VDIMM is not a single voltage on this motherboard, because if you watch the VRM analysis, you would know that there is a voltage controller and a power phase for each set of DIMM slots specifically. And that actually allows you to do things like having these two memory slots at 1.92 volts and these two slots at 2 volts. Or really, you could go to the absolute extreme and set these to 1.2 and this to 2 volts. Like, you can set different voltages on your memory slots depending on what memory sticks you have in them. So if you have two memory sticks that don't really tolerate super high voltage, you can put your two memory sticks that don't tolerate super high voltage into two slots, and the ones that prefer more voltage into the other two slots, and you can run different voltages on your memory slots. But you can't actually check what both of your memory slot, like what your different memory slots are running at, because there's only one VDIMM. So read point on the probit connector. And the reason for this is EVGA actually went for making this thing like super accurate, so you get a proper ground reference for every single one of the pins. But I think it would have been just better if they grabbed a ground reference from like right behind the CPU and just pulled a ground line once and then just crammed more voltage readings onto that, because currently you can't actually monitor all the different voltages that the board offers for you to play with, which I think, well, that's kind of unfortunate. Though this is definitely a better way of doing voltage read points than what a lot of other top-end overclocking motherboards do, which is solder bumps. Basically, usually in an awkward place, like if the 24-pin, which this one has a right-angled 24-pin, but if you have a 24-pin sticking right up, the solder bumps will be like right next to it. For your various voltages, and that actually makes measuring the voltage on those bumps really, really, really hard, because you need to get under the 24-pin power cable, and it's just not convenient. Like, if you're in the middle of a benchmark on liquid nitrogen, the last thing you want to be doing is trying to measure voltages at the same time. So while this is like a very nice implementation, it's not particularly useful because the range of what you can measure on it is actually kind of limited. So that's kind of unfortunate. Next to that, we find a 5-channel dip switch. This is for your PCIe slots, and this is another really cool feature, in my opinion, for this board, because I'm a big fan of big multi-GPU setups, so 3-way, 4-way, I love it. And for competitive benchmarking, not for gaming. Like, games supporting 3-way or 4-way anything is just basically non-existent. But benchmarks run 3-way and 4-way just fine, so there it's really, really nice, and this board is obviously targeted at extreme overclocking and competitive overclocking, so it's nice to have this PCIe slot layout, because you can run 1, 2, 3 like that if you want, 3 slot spacing on your GPUs. That works just fine. And you can also run, of course, 4-way. You would run 1, 2, 3, 4. And this PCIe slot is actually like wired into the CPU. It's not off the PCH, which is a nice thing, and it's a full 8x. And that's why you actually get the 5-channel dip switch up here, because it allows you to disable this slot, this one, and this one. And the reason why you'd want to be able to disable your PCIe slots is if you're running liquid nitrogen or, say, custom water cooling, and all of your motherboard, like all of your graphics cards are water blocked into place and actually really hard to remove. If one of the GPUs is causing the motherboard to not start up, you can just disable the PCIe slot and you can boot up without that GPU. It'll basically act like that GPU doesn't exist, which is really convenient for certain troubleshooting scenarios. Now then, to make it also easy for you to tell if your like which PCIe slots are enabled and which aren't, you get 2 LEDs again. So you get a white LED here and a green LED. The green LED tells you if the PCIe slot has a working device in it. The white LED tells you if the PCIe slot is enabled. So if you switch a PCIe slot off, so let's say we push this pin, like this switch down here, the 5th switch off, then the white LED for this slot down here would not turn on. So these would just be, they wouldn't light up. Whereas all the other enabled ones would light up white, and if you put a device in them, they light up white and green. Now, the only unfortunate thing about this is that since these are right next to the PCIe slots, if you're running a big multi-GPU setup, there's a pretty good chance that seeing these LEDs is going to be really hard, because there's going to be a GPU sitting right over them. So yeah, it's nice that it's there. It's just kind of hard to use. And I have the same complaint for the LEDs above the memory slots, because normally if you're in a overclocking environment with a test bench, you're going to be somewhere to the, to the right of the motherboard so that you can access this corner and this area of the board, and have good access to all of your LN2 pots, which would be located right around here. And well, if you're located, if you're to the right of this board, seeing these LEDs tends to be kind of hard, especially because the VRM heatsink has a heat pipe that goes right over them. Though you can generally get an idea if this area is glowing red or white. So that's not too bad. But when you're running a 3-way or a 4-way setup, seeing these LEDs is very, very difficult. They're buried under GPUs. So it's nice that those indicators are there. They're just not super, they're not most effectively positioned. But, nice that it's there. And you actually get LEDs for also your M.2 slots. You get LEDs for your, these are the U.2s, yeah. So the U.2 connectors get LEDs. These flash on power on. This board is loaded out with troubleshooting LEDs everywhere. So that's actually really nice. Some of them are kind of inconveniently positioned, but they are definitely useful. The board also has a speaker, which is I find it actually kind of handy when I'm benchmarking on air cooling or water cooling, where I'm not paying a ton of attention to the system. This is really handy to know when you have to start mashing the delete button, because it'll beep at you. You can disable the beeper in the BIOS, obviously. So it's not like it's just, it's not going to go drive you insane, but when you clear the BIOS, the first startup will always beep. So, yeah. But, nice enough feature to have, in my opinion. There's a lot of motherboards that have this and just have it removable, so I don't really, it's not a huge benefit, but it is there. And next to that, you find this 6-pin power connector. This is here basically for running big multi-GPU setups, because your 24-pin has exactly two 12-volt pins in it, and those two 12-volt pins are good for about 10 amps each, which means if you have, which basically means you can push about 240 watts into your PCIe slots without burning all of your, without burning down your 24-pin. Which, if you think about this, right, each of these PCIe slots is spec'd at 75 watts output, and we go times 4, that's 300 watts. You can't you can't run a high power consumption 4-way GPU, or even a 3-way GPU setup, because a 3-way setup is going to get you to 225 before you do overclocking on some cards, like a RX 480. You're going to be pushing 225 before you do any overclocking. After overclocking, you're going to go over that very, very easily. And if you're on a 4-way RX 480 setup, then God help the 24-pin, because it's going to need it. Except not on this motherboard, because you have the 6-pin down here. You plug that in, and your PCIe slots are going to be pulling a good chunk of their power from the 6-pin, and the 6-pin is a 3x12, so that is capable of delivering an extra 360 watts to the PCIe slots. So that's a handy feature, again, for competitive overclockers. For basically everybody else, this is kind of irrelevant, because most people won't be running a huge multi-GPU setup. Though maybe if you're running some kind of high power consumption RAID cards or sound cards or capture cards, this might come in handy, but most PCIe devices don't tend to go. GPUs are generally the biggest power hogs. So this is mostly for large multi-GPU setups. It's not really meant for anything else, but you could use it for sound cards and that kind of thing as well if you have some exceptionally power-hungry non-GPU devices. Now, moving back up the board, in the I/O area, you get a clear Cmos switch. So for those of you using this motherboard incorrectly and inside a case, because really this is meant for... this is really a motherboard meant for a test bench, but if you are using this motherboard in a case because you're a filthy casual, you do get a clear Cmos switch right there. Because again, if you screw up your settings, the motherboard will not recover, so you can just wipe the BIOS from there. And that pretty much covers it in terms of the physical features that this motherboard comes with. for extreme overclocking, and it's well equipped. I really do think I actually love all the different troubleshooting LEDs around the board. They are like, that's a really cool feature. I really like that, and I'm a fan of the postcode. Like the minus 64 degrees readings on the postcode and the temperature monitoring on the postcode. That's really, really cool. I've had other motherboards that kind of did that. They didn't go into the negative temperature range, so this is just like a straight upgrade over that, and I do think that's a really cool feature. But the lack of the slow mode switch and safe boot, as well as retry buttons, is that's something I would really like to see from this motherboard, because it's so close to perfect. And the other complaint I have is this, right? The Probit connector, it's too limited. It's just like you can't measure. There's far more voltages on this motherboard I would like to be able to measure than what this connector allows you to measure. And yeah, that's really my only complaints. Other than that, this is very close to perfect as far as an overclocking motherboard's feature setup goes. But safe boot, retry, slow mode, and more voltage read options would be really, really welcome in future motherboards from EVGA. But for now, this thing is like probably is really well featured. So yeah. That's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below if you would like to support what we do here at Gamers Nexus. There is a Patreon link. You can find that in the description and probably in the comments. I have a channel called Actually Hardcore Overclocking, which is even more extreme overclocking focused than this video. So if you'd like to check that out, that would be cool. And see you next time.